Thanks, Anna. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, good. So today's theme is equality. When I was asked to do this talk, I thought it was kind of a good subject because my background is in fashion design. But lately, in the last 4 or 5 years, I've been moving more into brand consulting, educating brands on how to improve their use of materials. And one kind of prevalent issue in the industry right now is this idea of kind of who's responsible for changing and making things more sustainable. Is it the consumer or is it the brand? And in my opinion, it's kind of that both have the kind of responsibility that they need to work on transparency and education. So I'm going to go through today and kind of talk about each side, the brand and the consumer side. And also it's Fashion Week, so it's very good timing. Happy Fashion Week for those of you that are involved in it. So first thing I want to say is, what does sustainability mean to me? And one thing I want to address is the term sustainability, I think, has become so convoluted that I don't think we really have a definition of what it is exactly. And across all disciplines, so not just in fashion, also in food, in technology, in building. What is sustainability? And I think this is an issue that when we're trying to address the topic, a lot of people get turned off by it, mostly because they don't really understand what it is. And for me, I think the term sustainability kind of needs to move towards the topic of improvement. So in the last 4 years since I finished my master's thesis, that's what I've been doing, is kind of working on how to improve mostly materials, but how to improve situations rather than just make them more sustainable. So I think when we talk about fashion specifically, when we say sustainability, we're actually producing things and consuming them. So the term sustainability, we will never reach an exactly a sustainable point. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about a bit today. So just a little bit of background on myself. I was born in Australia, as Anna mentioned, and I grew up in Colorado in the States. I moved there when I was 6. So after university, where I studied, I moved to New York, and I worked in fashion, became a famous fashion designer, or that was my plan anyway. And then I was working in a big mass market retailer, kind of designing for them. This is kind of the issue between my work life and my personal life. So in work, when we would start a collection, we would go to the fabric library, we would pick fabric, we'd send it to our partners, usually in Asia. They would come back 2 weeks later with a prototype. 6 weeks later, it was in the store. Never once did I question, where does this material come from? Who's sewing the garments? What is their life like? I didn't ask these questions. It just wasn't part of my daily job. And equally in my personal life, I was living in Brooklyn at the time, working in Manhattan. Often I would stay in the city on the weekends, so I would just buy new clothes because actually it was easier I had a discount from the company I was working in, and it was easier just to buy something new rather than to go home and take something out. And again, it was just my mentality. It's how I thought. I didn't ever think of the impact that had, except perhaps on my wallet, but otherwise it didn't bother me that much. So then this is Colorado, and I was there snowboarding with friends, and I was saying to a friend, I really wish I could come back here more often. And he said, hey, but you're a designer, why don't you do this jacket competition? They fly the winners out here, and they compete for 3 days, and then you can snowboard for 3 days as well. I thought, cool, when is the deadline? He's like, tomorrow. I was like, okay. So on the flight back to New York, I drew this sketch of a jacket, and then I got into this competition. And it wasn't until I arrived at the actual competition that I realized the whole kind of subject was about pre-consumer waste. So the snowboard jacket company had done the competition to have the competitors design a jacket with the kind of excess material from their seasons before. And when I went there, I was talking to the director, and he said, this is just some of our leftovers from one season. And when you think of like a snowboard jacket, for example, you have so many parts. So it's not just the fabric, but also you have the lining, you have elastic, you have stoppers, zips, pulls. There's so many parts. I remember looking at all of these tables full of stuff and thought, whoa, if they're doing this much waste, how much are we doing at this huge retailer that's producing 300,000 units or more. And then just in terms of numbers, this is from the Zero Waste Fashion Design book. And when we look at, it's estimated that there's about 400 billion square meters of fabric produced, or in 2015 there was. And they say this number is a bit debatable, but it's like the average amount of fabric that's wasted when you cut a garment is about 15%. So if you really take 15% of the 400 billion, you come back with 60 billion square meters of kind of pre-consumer waste in terms of material. And then I thought, okay, how does this actually translate into a visual? What does actually 60 billion square meters look like? And essentially, it's the same as 6 million football fields. So this is just before it gets, this is not anything to do with the post-consumer once you wear the garment. This is just before it goes into the full production process. So this is relatively new from 2015. So 10 years ago in New York, I didn't have these type of numbers, but I knew there must be a huge amount of problems we had with the company I was working in. So then I decided to move to New York, from New York to Berlin, to study a master's in sustainable fashion. Because when I asked everyone at my company, what's happening with all our waste materials, what can we do? No one really had an answer, and no one knew. And I was like, okay, then I'm going to have to learn this for myself. So I decided to go back to school. And then during the course of the master's, we had to, of course, pick a topic or a thesis. And my thesis was actually on leather and fur. And I think a lot of times when people say, what, you studied sustainable fashion and you worked with fur? And that's another point I want to kind of address today in terms of quality also in materials. When I did the whole research of the fur, because I went through the whole supply chain from the farm all the way to the production, there's a lot of things that are, of course, negative, but there's also a lot of positive. When you speak to a farmer and you learn about their livelihoods, you have a different perspective than when I speak to someone who's a member of PETA, for example. And this kind of started my kind of spark into the interest of materials and what are kind of the pros and cons of every material. So this is an example of an art residency I was in, and this is the exhibition I did for it. And essentially, it's 7 different materials, and then I put a clothing hang tag. So on one side, I had the care label, and then on the other side, it would say the kind of environmental and social impacts of the material. And the idea here is for the consumer, or the viewer in this case, to kind of look at the material in a bit of a different way. And I think this is part of this whole idea of when we say sustainability and improving, we have to kind of change our mindset into how we view things. Because I think just by when someone says to you, oh, this is a good material, what does good actually mean? And every material, no matter if it's fur or polyester or viscose or linen, everything has some type of impact. And that's why I'm saying we need to try to improve and reduce the impacts rather than just say, no, this material is bad, this material is good. From here, I started working with brands, kind of educating internally, like more on the design side. Because I'm a big believer in that design has really a lot of responsibility and ability to create a lot of change. And as we were doing all this research into how to educate designers, then we went further down the chain, like, okay, then how do we educate retail staff? Okay, then how do you educate the consumer? And that's when I realized, okay, the consumer also has a huge part of this supply chain. It's not just the one side of the brands. And then again, in terms of numbers, clothing production doubled from 2000 to 2014. The number of garments exceeded 100 billion by 2014. And this is from the Greenpeace report, and there was also on the Greenpeace blog saying 3 out of 4 garments will end up in landfills or be incinerated. Only a quarter will be recycled. So this is also something, once we have the issue of the pre-consumer waste, but then also at the end, what's happening to these materials after we buy them, after they're in our closets. So one question I always ask is, how did we actually get here? And I think this is also a good point to make, that a lot of people, both on the industry side and consumption side, are frustrated with the situation we have now. But obviously, there's a reason that we got to this point. And one of my favorite quotes, I don't know if you guys know the book Stuffication, and if you haven't read it, I suggest you do. It's by James Wallman, and it's a very good book about the kind of issue or the idea of consuming experiences versus things. And he covers a lot of different topics, from minimalism all the way to hoarding. And this quote really stood out to me when I read the book, because it's talking about in the 1920s, Hoover was president in the US. And I think the main point from here is, the dilemma was simple. Either the farmers and factories needed to produce less, or people had to consume more. If you had been in a position to choose the path the country took, which would you have picked? Produce less or consume more? Well, I think this is a very good question to ask, because of course we've arrived at this situation, and we have to all be aware that it takes a lot to change, that it's not something that we can just change our mentality from one day to the next, both in the way we produce and in the way we consume. So I'm just going to talk a bit about, when I say the equality between the brand and consumer, I'm going to focus a bit on the designer in terms of the brand side, and then what you as an individual can do in terms of the consumer. Oh. Sorry. So yeah, designer. So first, this is a very kind of minimalist supply chain. And obviously, in general, it's much more complex than this. But just to give you an idea, if you talk about the beginning, where the material comes from, where it's produced or grown, then the kind of design, creative thinking, then how it's produced, manufactured, going then to the retail consumer, and then how it's disposed of. So this is obviously a very linear system. And this is essentially how the supply chain is set up now in the fashion industry. And when we're trying to add in sustainability, for example, and we're trying to add this in, we put it in different parts of the supply chain, but essentially we're working backwards, and we're going against a system that's already existing. So really the whole system has to change. So this is, I think maybe many of you are familiar with this concept of circular economy or cradle to cradle. But basically, I've put kind of this design thinking, also in terms of sustainability, this holistic approach, in kind of the center. And if we can do that, then we can essentially kind of design out waste and make a better kind of future for the next generations. And I just want to highlight here a few things in terms of, in design, what's happening. So for example, bio and recyclable material. So this is one thing a lot of brands, designers are starting to think about, okay, how can we produce a fabric from the very beginning that can either go into these two cycles, either be biodegradable, so you can literally put it into your compost bin, or recyclable. And design for disassembly is another topic within that realm. However, for fashion, it's a bit more difficult, because to disassemble garments, at this point, then you have to have a very good strategy to educate your consumer on that, because perhaps the consumer doesn't know what parts need to be taken apart. Zero waste is really about designing the actual pattern you make so that you have less waste in the cutting phase. And I think it's also end-use disposal. It's a good thing to ask, like, what is my consumer going to use this product for? For how long are they going to keep it? Are they going to keep it for 1 year? Are they going to keep it for a few months? Are they going to keep it for a lifetime? And social empowerment is really about, okay, how can I work with my local communities? Or if I'm more of a global company, how can I empower the communities and the livelihoods of the people working around my factories? And then this emission reduction comes really in this kind of, one is in this phase between the producing of the fiber and the production. And then also in the transport is a big way we can reduce emissions. And chemical use is, again, this is from a design standpoint. Okay, how can I use materials? Do I need to, after the material is produced, how do I eliminate as many chemicals as possible? And does that come from not dyeing something, not using color? Does it come from the actual material and how it's produced? So asking these kind of questions. And then I have supply chain ownership and transparency, which is more on a large-scale business sense of how can we kind of take ownership of our supply chains and understand. Because often when you look at a supply chain map, for example, for fashion production, maybe it goes to 30 different places before it reaches the end place. So how can we streamline this? And then education and responsibility, which is just the idea of designers kind of getting more involved themselves, and also how to communicate this to their consumer. So now I'll talk a bit more about the consumer as an individual. And the thing is, I can't stress enough that you as an individual actually have a huge power. And I think we kind of have this mentality, oh, well, if I don't do this, someone else will, so why do I have to change? And I think this is a big miss, and this is something that we really need to kind of, again, change our mindset into. And the first thing I would say is really ask more questions, because we don't. We buy what's in front of us. We don't think to ask twice. And like I said before, as my example, that I was working in the fashion industry, consuming fashion, I didn't think ever about these things. And I know it's also a lot because the average person wakes up every day and maybe doesn't have time to go through and really think about all these things. But I just wanted to outline a few points that I think if you want to get involved, what you can do. And the first is educate yourself. So look at the brands you like, do some research. What's on their website? Do they have information? Do you want to find more information? Maybe you can write them to find out more. Also, in terms of companies that are really kind of have a great outreach towards consumers would be Greenpeace, that's doing the detox campaign and pushing back against brands. Fashion Revolution, who's produced this Fashion Transparency Index, which is great because it goes through and grades brands on how they're doing in 4 different categories. And then WRAP UK, which is also has a consumer platform about reducing emissions. So then also get involved and have a voice. I think you, like what I said before, you have a lot of power with your wallet. When you decide to make a choice to buy something, you actually give that word back to the brand and you communicate your position with it. And also making sustainability, as the term, cool. I think now it's really, especially when we come from the fashion sector, people don't think of it as something, as a necessity or cool, and they think of it as an extra add-on, and it really needs to be part of our daily way of thinking. And then the last point is really start with your own wardrobe. So I went to a talk at the Copenhagen Fashion Summit in 2014, and Vanessa Friedman, who's the fashion editor for New York Times, she said, what about building your own sustainable wardrobe? You have to decide for yourself what it means to be sustainable. And if that to you is buying the best brand that's of the highest material quality, and maybe it's the most expensive, but you buy less of it, that's one way. Maybe to you is buying only secondhand. Maybe to you it's actually going through your clothes and really looking at, okay, when I put this on my body, do I know where it comes from? Do I know where the materials come from, where it's produced? And start to look at what you have in your own closet. And so I just want to say, in terms of quality, brands have the responsibility to give information to the consumers, and consumers have the responsibility to get the information from the brands. So it is an equal two-way street. And I just want to leave you with this last quote, which I think sums up a lot of what I've talked about today. Because sustainability isn't just a pretty glamorous process of using recycled materials to design something that may or may not be in the color green. It's about redesigning every single aspect, from sourcing materials to designing, to production, to shipping, and then eventually designing a way that those products can be disposed of responsibly. That's a mammoth task, so it's no wonder that designers and manufacturers are finding it so difficult. And I think this is from Alice Rawsthorne, who's a design editor of International Herald Tribune. And I can't stress this enough, that it is a really massive task, and we all need to kind of take our part in it, and slowly things will start to change. So thank you very much for coming today, guys.